I'm Teresa Dunn, and this is For Art's Sake. My name is Teresa Dunn. I live in East Lansing, Michigan. I teach at Michigan State University, where I've been since 2006. And I actually grew up in Murfreesboro, Illinois, and this is my first exhibition in my home state. And the paintings that you see here, their origins come from a couple of different places. In the summer of 2017, I spent about half the summer in Venice in Italy, where I spent a lot of time over the last several years. And some of the things that really intrigue me about Venice are the fact that it is an island and surrounded by water and boats. And when I'm there, I'm very attuned to the weather, the light, the atmosphere, the environment in a way that I'm not when I'm in the States and you're in a car. The way you get from here to there is you're always going from place to place in a car, but being on foot or by a boat, it's a completely different experience. And that this past summer, I actually, on a whim, with that, there's no real reason behind it, I saw a circular pad of paper in an art store and I bought it. I'd never been really interested in the circle as a shape or shaped works to paint on, but I thought it was interesting, and so I took it home with me. And then immediately following my Venice trip in 2017, I actually had a residency in Cuttyhunk Island in Massachusetts, which is the last of the Elizabeth Islands in Massachusetts. And before I got to Cuttyhunk, I thought, well, I'm going to take this pad of circular paper and just planning to spend that week residency using the circle. And so I painted all those circles a different color. They were all fairly small, and I had some ovals too. And my intentions were, before I got there, were to paint some abstracted landscapes, and I had a vague idea of what I wanted to do. But when I got to Cuttyhunk, it's a very small island with only 52 year-long inhabitants. And even though it's about the same size as the main island in Venice, it's almost completely deserted and very little is built up. It's scruffy vegetation, there's the water that's surrounding you, the kind of light and fog, you really aware, in a very similar way that I am aware of the environment when I'm in Venice. I felt that presence of the atmosphere even more, but it was very deserted. And so thinking about kind of this isolated environment, and then I was really interested in all the boats that were there. Some of them were in the water, some of them were on land, and started painting the beaches, the boats, and the water. On return from the residency, kind of an idea was born, and I was really interested in the circular format, which is they're like little islands themselves. And I wanted to start to make narrative figure paintings again, where for a while I'd been making these abstractions. I started collecting, some of them were toys that I borrowed from my daughter, some objects I already had or I bought. I was collecting things that I could start to make these little setups, and I don't really think of them as still lifes, but as theatrical sets where I imagined the life of an invented female protagonist. I don't really even have a name for this character, but I imagined a woman on an island, and certain things like the symbols of the boat and the moon that I had seen a lot in my travels became prominent elements that I wanted to repeat. So the painting back here is one of the first images that developed from this project, where the working title was A Woman, an Island, the Moon, and kind of focused the different setups that I would make, thinking of this imaginary place and ideas like isolation and belonging, or home and homelessness, and the kind of spaces that you might see might be open or closed, and rearranging the setups in various ways. For example, thinking about at nighttime, the island at night with the full moon. And something that has been important to me over many years is in my narrative works, the sense of the fantastical. I'm interested in, and have long been interested in, the writings of Gabriel Garcia Marquez and magical realism, and that events, while not possible in our own physical reality, that suspension of disbelief is capable of existing in the paintings, and so things that are unbelievable become believable. And that allowed me to play with scale or the absence of gravity in the way that exists in our physical reality. So other influences over the years that I've had, in addition to Gabriel Garcia Marquez, are Italo Calvino, who's an Italian writer, the book Invisible Cities in particular, and then Elena Ferrante, who's also another contemporary Italian writer. And something that's just as interesting to me, talking about like the toys and the scale change and the different kind of spaces, is that in Invisible Cities, the premise of the book is that Marco Polo's telling Kublai Khan about his travels and adventures across the world. And each chapter is this different, very bizarre, kind of fantastical city, each with its strange complexities. And in the end of the book, and it's a spoiler alert, so if you want to read Invisible Cities before I tell you here, you should go check it out. But it turns out that all of the different lands that Marco Polo was talking about are actually Venice, but different aspects of the same city. And so thinking about the kind of different perspectives and unexpected ways of seeing or moving through a space have had an impact on the work, and playing around with those different perspectives, proportions, things that are out of scale. And I think that it's intriguing for the viewer, but also plays into some of the narrative ideas that I'm interested in. So something else that has, as a part of this particular show, the title of the show is Cover the Waterfront, which I borrowed from Billie Holiday's song, Cover the Waterfront. And a lot of the lyrics in that song go through my mind as I'm making the setups, as I'm painting, the horizon, the great unknown, longing, yearning. So there's this sense of melancholy and detachment and distance. And so in some of in the works that you see a remove, or that change in scale can play into that sense of distance of the characters that may be in the paintings from each other, or the viewer from the scenario, or this imaginary female protagonist, that there's a distance, there's this disconnect, and thinking about how that relates to isolation and yearning, and the island being that both protected by the waters and isolated by the waters. So there's that paradox of being on a physical island, but also this kind of interior psychological island space. So I want to talk a little bit also about the way these were made, and how the color is developed from that process. So when I first went to Cutty Hunk with my original batch of 14 circles, I had painted each of them a random color with flash, which is an acrylic sign paint, and they come in lots of different brilliant colors, and the underpainting in this, and I left it in a lot of areas, is this lavender. This one was painted on the green. This one was the original color is this teal. And sometimes when I made a painting on top of that, I purposely chose the color, because I knew I wanted to set a particular tone for like a mood for the painting. And other times I would choose at random, or something that felt very different, in order to create a sense of tension. And allows me to mix colors that are unexpected. So if I'm starting with a ground that's very different than the typical white canvas or white panel, or in this case they're all on paper, then it forces me to really re-examine my expectations of what colors will do. And so I find myself in this entire body of work developing color palettes that are very different than I have before. And so I find that to be a really interesting kind of the creative impulse is pushed by these sometimes random and sometimes purposeful choices. Talking also a little bit about the process with that paper. All of the works are painted on paper, and then they're also then mounted to panel after the fact. I thought it was important that they read very flat. I didn't want to present them like drawings. You might normally mount works on paper on a mat board and then put it in a frame behind plexi, but I thought it was really important that they be about that circular format and feel flush to the wall, and really confine them to this space, thinking about that again, that going back to that physical environment of the circle and that isolating island as a notion. Something else that has become important too, I referenced the writer Elena Ferrante, and I recently read, she had a quartet of books that told the story of two young girls. It was the coming of age kind of story of two young girls through their adulthood into their the latter stages of their life. And something that was really important to me about that book was the incredible amount of detail. It's one story, but four volumes, and I think over 1,000 pages in total, and the incredible amount of detail and specificity in the narratives, and thinking about trying to jam an entire life into that small container. And so as I was making these different circles, thinking about what kind of details I was wanting to pull out of this imagined life, this imagined story. And so some of them are kind of larger scenarios, like the painting on the left, where there's the house and the vehicles and the trees, the environment, the pulled out kind of view. Others are more specific, kind of like an event. This one's called Visitation, and so the characters greeting each other. So there's a specific kind of story that you start to read there. And others are like the painting on the right here, that are more like a moment, and they imagine and the viewer is in that space looking down at the grapefruit along with the bird, and I'm trying to put the viewer in that space and hopefully spark some kind of recognition, particularly like in terms of solitude or waiting, that pause, a moment of reflection, trying to put people into an interior kind of space, where the paintings on the left are more about that externalized space. So I'm going to continue to talk a little bit more about the process, in particular with these group of 4 paintings here. And so, as I mentioned before, I started all of these by painting a solid color of acrylic ground first, which is very different than starting with a white canvas, because in a white canvas or a white surface, everything is added, where with the colored panels, colored papers, there's a lot of addition, but there's also subtraction. So as much as I put in, I have to have a sense of reserve as what I'm not going to put in, because the color functions as atmosphere. And just for example, in this painting, the green is the underpainting, and there are many areas in the painting where I have avoided putting paint on in order to preserve that atmosphere. This one is called Green, with some references to envy, but so that losing that green color would have compromised some of what I wanted the viewer to hopefully get from this painting, to think about the relationship of this figure to the two on the other side, and that sense of green as a symbolic color, and how you might be urged to think about the relationship between these figures and the tension between the characters in that way. And the painting on the far left, about half of it has not been painted. It's the blue. The blue is the ground, and I think that it creates a sense of mystery, and some of those things that I talked about, wanting that the melancholy, that longing, that sense of distance and remove. And so I have to, in the actual painting process, kind of embody that by allowing, restraining myself from covering the entire canvas, covering the entire picture plane with new colors, but how to incorporate that. It's a really interesting challenge for me as the painter, as the maker. The painting back here with the teacup, the pink is the underpainting, and there's some real opportunities too for how I transition into that, where the teacup and the mirror appear to be dissolving into the space. And so navigating that kind of relationship between adding paint and allowing the color that's already present to have a dialogue, just as the maker, it's an interesting challenge, but it also helps feed into some of the conceptual ideas that I have about narrative. So some other recurring elements besides the moon and the female characters are different modes of transport, and particularly the boat, but there's also bicycles, or there's airplanes, but motorcycles. But one of the reasons that I'm interested in those forms, particularly the boat, and you'll notice that there, most of the time, there's nobody inside those vehicles. There's nobody inside the boats. There's nobody driving them. They're maybe adrift. Maybe they're grounded. I think it's fruitful ground for talking about some of the symbolism, or what that could be an analogy or a metaphor for. And the boat or the bicycle or the car thinks about the journey. And in my mind, these are journeys that possibly don't have a beginning or an end, or the destination is unclear. And that's a very unsettling kind of notion, to be a boat adrift, and built on the kind of melancholy, where they feel like the colors of the paintings frequently are very vibrant, have like kind of positive connotations. And they maybe suggest a season, or kind of a time of day that's like satisfying, but then the contradiction being in that there's this aimlessness or an uncertainty with things like the boats, and where they're going, or where they're not going, or where they're incapable of going. Something else that I think is interesting to talk about in this particular group is going a little bit back to process. Is that I have recently been really opening up my mark, and so you'll see a lot of moments like in this painting where it's very loose and almost moves into abstraction, and I'm very cautious about like how much I'm describing and where. And so the paintings are, some of them are on the verge, like this one in particular, of being an abstraction, that balance between image and that representation and abstraction, the image and the abstraction, the mark for its surface quality, and the mark to describe form. And some of the form is described in more of a modeled, volumetric way. Other forms, like the castle in the background, are very illustrative. Some of that has to do with where those images are coming from. I'm borrowing again from coloring books or drawings that my daughter has done, and they feel like an illustrative translation like that pushes the viewer to a certain kind of, or guides the viewer to a certain kind of mindset, and that land of suspension of disbelief, like in the movies where I want my viewers to not think about these as still lifes, but as other possible realities, other possible worlds, and whether that world is another dimension or kind of a dream-like state, or memory, or a reverie of what could have been, as we think about our own lives and look back at different times in our lives, and then encompass the what if. I like that idea of the possibility. So the openness of Mark and some of the different ways that I'm describing form allows the paintings to be in this narrative space that's actually, even though there's a lot of melancholy and questions of solitude, but that also allow for openness and possibility. My first intros into being an artist as a young student 20 plus years ago was actually in drawing. I really connected to the immediacy of what you could do with a pencil or charcoal. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about drawing as a tool, drawing as a medium, and then I can talk about the particular images here. And drawing, I think, is a really important place for visual thinking to happen. So ideas about composition or space, or what Mark can do. And even in these drawings, some of the things I was talking about with openness and closed or tight marks and loose marks are happening here. But I love the quickness of a drawing and how you can transform a space with just a few marks. And it's like this, in the way that it's mental notation. And so I feel like seeing the drawings next to the paintings, there's a different window into my thinking. And when you take color out, you really see how I'm thinking about Mark and space and atmosphere. And it's much less about pattern and what color does for setting any kind of narrative tone. So with these three drawings, the one on the left is similar to a painting that's not in this exhibition, but it's more of a study of that particular scenario. The other two, they don't have an accompanying painting, but there's similarities in the middle drawing to the green painting that I referenced a little bit earlier. Just exploring deeper, the drawings give me an opportunity to explore deeper a singular idea. So the relationship between these two women and the kind of conversation that you imagine might have happened or going to be transpiring. And in particular with this little drawing, as I was making it, I had initially planned for the entire composition to fit within the circle. It's the only work in the exhibition that is not confined exactly to that circle. And for whatever reason, I couldn't get the hand to stay in the circle, but I thought it was really important gesture, and so I wanted to keep that the hand in the image. So when I cut this, I attached the drawing onto the panel, mounted on the panel, and when I cut it out, I left that hand in there. I thought it was a really a tender moment and a really important moment between those individuals, and without that, the painting is a little bit more confrontational, but that physical touch and that hand extending beyond the reach of the circle was really critical to leave that there. In a lot of the paintings, you'll notice different objects, some of which I've already talked about, like the symbol of the moon, or the boats, the vehicles, the houses. Also recurring a lot in my work in general, not just this body, is the bird. The bird seems to continually make an appearance, and I'm not exactly sure I can answer why. But some of the things that I like about it is it feels like a stand-in for other characters. I think it's an interesting possibility as a metaphor or a symbol. Some of the baggage that the bird carries with it in different cultures or histories, that a bird inside the house could be a bad omen or a good omen, depending on your superstitious history. But I think that it's a really interesting form and has a lot of possibility in how it can be read. And in this particular painting, the bird is typically something that you find outside. It's not a creature unless you're caging the birds that you find inside. But in this painting, it is inside, or in the space, and it's looking outside, and there's a kind of longing, an injustice maybe behind that. And the confrontation is between the bird and the motorcycle, and which is absent. So there's the motorcycle is a stand-in perhaps for someone who's not there, and the bird is examining that vehicle. And so setting up this kind of confrontational relationship between the vehicle and the bird, both stand-ins for other characters that are absent. So then the bird in this painting on the other wall is paired with the nest and the eggs, the two eggs in the nest. And the egg, thinking about cycles of life, the circle itself is a cycle, the shape of the particular panel, the oval, one a literal egg, the other that suggested that metaphor, the symbol of the egg. So there's some juxtapositions that the bird next to that form and within the form of the oval, which is egg-like, can talk about like new beginnings and notions in cycle, which are also embedded in the work in terms of seasons or the weather, thinking about those kind of things that they go around, come around, back to the journey of the boat, which is also the journey that I mentioned that had no origin and no destination, so that there isn't a linear beginning to these works, even though I painted them in a certain order. But as a narrative group, they have. It's more important for me to think of them as cyclical or nonlinear or circular kind of narratives.